Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I am one of your hosts, Derick, and with me is Evan. Good day to you, sir.
Good day to you, sir.
All right, we are on to our next verse here, which I need to actually open up the good book and find it. We are on Genesis 2:21. Reading it, it is, "So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and while he slept, took one of his ribs and closed up its place with flesh."
Should we recap what's happened in the past couple verses? What's going on leading up to this?
Yeah. God, why not? Yeah, God recognized that it was not good for man to be alone. That man needed a help. The animals were sort of offered up as a possible solution to that. They are not. So now we see the beginnings of the actual solution.
Mm-hmm.
Spoiler: the creation of
Woman.
woman. And so yeah, this is the beginning of that process,
Yeah.
if you will.
Excellent. Excellent.
So I suppose just following the verse chronologically, we might start with wondering what the significance of the sleep is here.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that induced? I mean, I guess again, if you're taking some sort of a historical perspective, it's like, well, it was anesthesia for the surgery, but I don't think that's exactly it, as we'll see in a moment why. And but it should be noted that some scholars might suggest that what's being described here in the original Hebrew is actually more of like a trance than what we think of as sleep.
Mm.
I don't know that actually matters too much either way, but
It was translated as a deep sleep too, I guess.
right,
It's not translated as just a sleep. There's something that's deep sleep is a different state of being than
well, it is,
just
but then
regular
that's
sleep,
where they're
and it's
saying, well, no, this deep sleep thing really means
really
trance.
means trance. I think we think of it as definitely more deep sleepy or trance is a very altered psychological state, I guess I would say.
Yeah, I actually think what's key here, though, is the contrast that this provides
Mm-hmm.
with the previous verse, with the animals.
Mm.
In the previous verse, we see man taking on like a participatory role with God, right?
Mm.
God is forming and man is naming, and it's like they're doing this thing together, right? Going through the animals, and it's a joint effort, right? But we might look here and see that by placing man in a trance or a sleep or whatever it is that knocks man out, if you will, God's showing the fundamental difference in our relationship with other humans compared with animals.
Mm.
Right? Because these verses describe the first time or whatever, the idea of another human entering this narrative, and it gives us some clues to the fundamental natures of human community, right? And this is a way of showing, well, no, that thing is different than your relationship with animals,
Mm-hmm.
because you don't participate with God in the human
Mm-hmm.
process,
Mm-hmm.
the naming process and all of that. And we'll get to the name thing in a little bit, a couple verses down the line here. But so yeah, so and to state it real quick, man does name the woman, but also sort of names himself in that verse. We'll see. It's very interesting. It is not the same naming thing that occurred with the animals.
Mm-hmm.
We'll sort of see why. But the main thing here is that man is not a participant in this particular act of creation the same way he was with the animals.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Instead, here the creation's revealed to him at the end. So, and the next thing I want to look at, this has been a source of interest, I would say, to Christians, and that is the rib. This is always a weird thing, this idea of a rib, and people have tried to understand the significance of a rib because it's
Yeah.
odd.
Yeah.
It should be noted, though, that other than these verses, this word is never translated as rib. Never, not once.
Really?
It
What's
is
it translated as?
it's always refers to side.
Oh, that's
And
interesting.
And because of this, there are several scholars I've read who suggest that the proper way to look at this verse, and it's a bit sort of like, let's call it vulgar, I guess, maybe compared to what maybe early translators were interested in portraying, or maybe they weren't aware of how to think of it. But what the verse is kind of suggesting is that no, the man is split in two, like a whole side of him, or a half has been taken away, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that goes to the idea of thinking of this as, well, no, it's the human, actually, not just the man in terms of the previous translation. And now the human is split into these two sides. And then the side is
sealed up.
It's cut off in that way. This is the only division that exists, is the sealing up.
That image is so much more powerful.
Significantly so, yes.
Like that image is so much that is so different. That's like shockingly different. Like the idea that,
well, it places the two parties on much more even footing. Let's put it that way.
Of course. Well, okay, yeah, that's obvious. And it's hard. We didn't address this, I guess, going into this section regarding the creation of Eve. But I guess we should address it briefly, that obviously this entire section and most of the story is loaded with a lot of historical baggage around where interpreters have gone in terms of the gender
I think we talked about that a little bit in our introduction to the whole two chapters.
The whole two chapters,
yeah.
And we're, I mean, not for the point of just ignoring it and pretending like those aren't issues and those haven't presented themselves, but I think the direction we've taken in interpreting so far has been one of saying we're pursuing the true as we can understand it interpretation of this. We're trying to figure out and understand what the thing is actually saying. We're not trying to right a bunch of wrongs at the moment.
Right.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And truth be told, I would say that in the past 20 years, I think the emphasis has been amongst a lot of biblical scholars, and maybe not all, but a lot, that they are out to correct a bunch of wrong perspectives. And they're saying, look, it wasn't actually saying this, it's saying this, which is better, which is nice, which is good. And it's like, well, your concern is with reacting to something that was incorrect.
Well, I mean, it's the nature of Protestantism.
Exactly.
So the protest is literally in the name.
Yeah. Well, and it's not like Protestants haven't been a part of that
right. Of course.
That history too.
Yeah. But I'm saying that is, it's sort of inbred in Protestantism that's the way you do things.
Fundamentally a response.
Theology is built on a series of reactions, and we're trying to avoid doing that. We're aware of what has been done, but we're not reacting specifically to those things.
No. And so taking that a step forward, I guess, is that there's this, I don't know, there's a lot of power in saying that man needed help, but what ultimately becomes the helper, or humanity needed help, the ultimate helper is found within a part of his character. It just needed to be parsed out. I mean, that is way more powerful than
we'll
saying
spend a few minutes here talking about the implications of this, because I think that's important. And I imagine, my notes only cover a handful of the implications of that. But so definitely, I think we should, if you have others that you perceive during this or come up with during this, then we should definitely tack those on as well. But let's get into those though, so we don't spoil them ahead of time, I guess. The sort of the full implications. Because the first thing I think that actually this stands out to me is it actually suggests that God hadn't failed to give man everything he needed to pursue this task, to achieve this task. Right. And looking back, we see that the not goodness of it all is the aloneness of it. It's the solo nature of it, that it was just the human. And so we might see it that it's like there was something that within the man, within the human here, that couldn't be accessed alone. And the only way to access it is through community. Right. and more specifically the unity of marriage, which we'll see in a few verses down the line. But to me, this almost harkens back to Genesis 1, where we suggested that the idea of God saying, let us make man in our image, might have something to do with humans individually not being able to put on the image of God, but rather humanity as a whole fulfilling that role, right? And so if you have the lone human, that's not enough. You need this sort of community of humans, which starts obviously with a second one. You know, and it's also this is important if we consider ourselves to be the offspring of this man and woman, right? Again, not specifically in a genetic sense, but like an archetypical sense. We're all sort of the offspring of these archetypes. They're described as our first parents in like an ontological sense. And as their offspring, we all contain a little bit of each within us. So it's interesting because in a way we share something in common with both the human prior to this, you know, but also the man and the woman after being split. It's like we sort of need to recognize that like there's bits of all of that within us. We are kind of like the human in that we have both parts, but those really are two distinct things, the sort of the masculine and the feminine, these ideas. Yeah. So, you know, another way of putting it would be that we need to acknowledge sort of that within all of us is something of the masculine and something of the feminine ideals. But at the same time, to be the fullest of what humans are meant to be, we need the companionship of a counterpart, right? And that counterpart sort of restores in us a sense of wholeness, right? And that's what we need. And we'll see this in Adam's. He actually shouts rhythmically what is a Hebrew poem when he sees woman for the first time, in sort of jubilation at this, because he feels made whole again by the woman. Yeah. So, and then we might also look at this splitting in two. And we could also say, okay, well, this is saying something fundamental about humanity too, right? Not just each of us individually having this component, but this is something fundamental to human nature as a whole. Yeah, I think the case of it being the human is actually captured well in this verse, and that it wasn't the man prior to this, but rather it was the human. And in that sense, yes, the masculine was dominant, maybe, and the argument for that being, you know, when you're splitting it in half, the woman is the part that's sort of taken out, that was extracted, that was hidden, that was dominated by the masculine. The feminine was suppressed within the human. And so it needed its own sort of vessel in order to make it apparent.
To inhabit. Yeah. Are you familiar or vaguely familiar with the idea, the Plato's idea of soulmates?
I don't think I've read his.
He presents this idea, and it's a shame we don't have it on hand, but he presents this idea. I can't remember which dialogue it is, but his concept of soulmates originates with Plato, and he argues that originally humans had 4 limbs and 4 legs. And what happened is that humans were cut in half and they were split up. And the idea of soulmates to him is this rejoining of the 2 parties who were initially split up.
Right.
That's what's so interesting with this, is he comes to an idea that very much rhymes with this. That idea that the joining together of things that were initially fused together. And that's what's being presented here. And I guess what's being presented is that's functionally, we need to have those 2 parts separated, but joined in a communal relationship.
Yes.
Which is very, very interesting. But I think it's fascinating that Plato would have the inclination towards that truth, and that makes it seem, I don't want to say necessarily more valid of an interpretation, but it certainly makes me think, look, this is something that's been recognized by someone who had no association with the biblical texts. Came up with something that is of a very similar idea. Just in his observance of the world, it makes you think, oh, that probably is what is being got out here.
There's a real question, I guess, that's being, he was attempting to answer the same question that this interpretation of that is.
Exactly.
But he was doing it on his own, whereas I'm suggesting here, I think we kind of see that answer to whatever that question is here in the Bible.
Yeah. That's much more powerful than trying to come up with some reason why a rib is more significant.
Yes.
That's harder. There's not as much. There's nothing that's presenting itself obviously and saying, oh yeah, that's powerful. The rib serves this particular function, therefore that's where it came from.
Yeah. The split in two. I mean, again, the word is often translated side. It's literally only here that they use rib. You know,
well, I don't. Slipped, took one of his sides and closed its place with flesh.
Yeah. Anyways, so there's another way we can sort of look at this. What this is saying, and this is going more to traditional interpretations of this, which again, it's my perspective that this can mean, it's layered. It can mean several things at once. So we're suggesting sort of this spiritual kind of idea of masculinity and femininity in these two ideals. I do think there is also a material component that is built into these verses. And perhaps this is where we get kicked off YouTube. But I do see in this passage a truth that is fairly strongly held in Christianity, though quickly losing favor in parts of the secular world, and that is the idea that there are in fact two genders. And in the next verse, I think we'll get into why the physical characteristics are inextricably linked with those two genders. But for now, for this verse, I think there is the point here is that there's not 7,000 different genders. There's two. All humanity is divided. Humanity is divided into the two complementary genders of man and woman, male and female. The problem is, though, and I think this is where much of Christianity has gotten it wrong, is I want to separate that idea of these two genders from societal roles, right? Because that's a different thing. Roles and norms and what, you know, a gender is supposed to do. That's honestly, that's not really spelled out in the Bible. In many places in any real significant way. There's a lot that Christians have sort of played the role of the Pharisees in Jesus's time and added a bunch of sort of like extra rules that it's like, but that's not there. You're adding rules now.
That comes back to our past interpretation of 18 and saying it might be best interpreted as help rather than helper.
Yes, exactly.
And when you have the vague word helper, it's very easy to put a lot of specifics on top of that.
Yes.
That aren't evident from it.
Right.
But if you add a little bit of more ambiguity to it and say, we don't even know if this is really attached to an individual person having this role, that does make it far more difficult to insinuate that that's what was intended.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So I do think, going back to the idea of the societal roles, I think Christians sort of share some blame for the societal mess we see around the whole subject of gender right now, because they developed too narrow a view of gender roles, which wasn't in any way founded upon good theology. And perhaps we'll get more into that issue maybe in the next few episodes. But I think the point of this passage when it comes to gender is to reveal to us the sort of spiritual truth of there being these two genders, and it's something that is deeper than we can necessarily even comprehend, because the nature of it is spiritual. It comes from God. God is the one who created this, right? However, as functional beings, right, the mixture of spiritual and material, what God is giving us here is as much of the spiritual knowledge as we need in order to use material properly, right? To behave in the correct functional manner. And the thing we need to know is these are the two genders, right? So yeah, that's something I see in that. And I think we'll get into more on that subject in the next couple of verses, particularly because these are issues I think that society is presently struggling with. And I think Christianity has answers, but not great ones always to these things. And I think because we don't think about the issue clearly enough. And I think there's more captured in this verse and the next few verses regarding these things that could hopefully give us some clarity on how to think about these issues. So
let me play devil's advocate just briefly. We propose the idea that this is a masculine and feminine representations, and we even talked a lot of times about how if you look at this, you could look at this even historically and talk about the intermixing of procreation involves masculine, feminine interacting, procreating, masculine, feminine interacting, procreating. And so that results in an intermixing of the masculine and the feminine. Why couldn't you then contend that that's what results in the complexity of gender?
So here's why, and this is we were going to get more into this in future episodes, but we can do it here since it came up. The mixing that you're talking about, right? When you mix cocoa and sugar or sweetener or something of some sort, or a flour, right? What happens is they mix together, and then you eventually have a mix, right? And you lose sight of the fact that it's actually made up of two components.
Correct. Become something new.
Right. And so I think the masculinity and the femininity, right? Those two ideals and existing in different ways in different people. And yeah, maybe men are generally more masculine, but I don't know. I think if you look at me and compare me and my masculinity to some woman, a Russian, peasant woman in the 16th or 17th century, I gotta be honest, I'm not as masculine as her, probably. There's a good chance I'm just not. It takes
Alyushka.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it takes a hardy woman to survive there, and one that I think has some masculine traits to her, more so than perhaps me, right? So I guess my point is the idea necessarily of man or woman being more masculine and more feminine, that's not as clear as it is. And frankly, I'll be honest, there's a lot of things I do in my life that probably skew much more feminine than one might expect. But we would lose eventually the idea that no, these are two separate influences upon our lives. And they're actually very important, particularly, as we'll see in the coming verses, in relations to the prevention of committing sins. Because what we'll see is, because of the two separate values and the two separate ways these two perspectives behave, they have very different susceptibilities to sin. And then after that, we'll see actually they have very different roles to play in ordering. It's interesting that we get the sin first and then the roles they play in ordering. But that is it. So it's important, I guess, that we remain aware of these two distinct influences. So while within us, we might become the mix, right? We might become the cocoa mixed with the flour, right? Or something. We might become that. The idea of there being the two genders and then being two separate and distinct things serves to, within reality, remind us that no matter what is inside us, what is inside us is the combination of these two components. And our perspective is built out of these two perspectives sort of working together within us. And so we're human in that way, you know, but the living the world living out the two gender dynamic serves as a constant reminder of that true nature that is within us, of these competing ideas, and going to these verses, that it is actually important that both perspectives have a part to play. They're a help to each other. They work together to order the world properly. And you can't know how to use them together and work together to order the world properly unless you recognize that there are two distinct things. And so the material reality of things is the reminder of this spiritual reality. Otherwise, we would lose that, right? And there's many things we do in life that are material things that serve to remind us of a spiritual reality. I mean, that's what the sacraments are, right? They're a material thing we do to remind us of the spiritual reality and connect with that. And so things like this, like the two genders, are built into the world, built into reality as that reminder.
Interesting. Okay. Do you think then the intermixing of the masculine and the feminine within individuals, and let's say the ratios of those distributions, is one of the causes of the confusion, of the need? Because it's very easy to argue that it would be very easy to argue that there could be 7,000 gradients of distribution of masculine and feminine.
Oh, I think there is.
Within a person.
Yeah.
You know, and maybe
I think the point here is actually that gender is something deeper than that.
And that's okay. Yeah. That's
like, it's something beyond that. It's not about, like, those ratios don't actually correlate.
Yeah, perfectly.
To one's gender.
Yeah. That's interesting. Okay. Yeah.
Again, I the 17th, 18th century Russian woman, probably more masculine than me. Not even probably.
Like, she'd probably beat us both up.
More, yes. So yeah, I mean, I think associating the particular ratio with gender is the mistake. I don't see any reason necessarily to do that. Now, there's a reason here we're seeing sort of an archetypal design, just for the sake of letting us see that within this story. But I don't think that necessarily correlates to exactly how life goes. In terms of it relating to the confusion, I think that might be too large a topic for now, but I will say that the confusion, it's interesting to note that as gender norms have broke down, right? And so we've got now a situation where people of different genders do different things. The norms don't stand the same way. Suddenly now there's an obsession with changing one's gender and not being a part of one's gender.
Well,
you would think if the idea is we were for sure, too restrictive, then you'd think, well, no, it would be during the restrictive time that you would be obsessed with becoming something other than, what you are.
View that as more ideal state.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting now that those norms have broke down. And I do think it's actually still a good thing that they broke down. I think actually this is sort of the pendulum swinging the other direction because it was pushed too far away by those norms. But it's a strange dynamic that's when this has occurred. That's not how things would typically unfold, or the expectation you would have.
the more equitable the society has become on gender roles. This is actually shown if you look at Scandinavian countries that are
Right.
hyper equitable,
Yep.
the more genders are assuming hyper-gendered demeanors. The women are becoming more feminine, the men are becoming more masculine.
Right.
Is that's observed both in their profession choices, but also in the aesthetics, what they choose to wear, how they're presenting themselves. Yep. It's a very interesting thing. You would think that it would be the opposite, that people wouldn't lean into gender roles as they become more, not, I shouldn't say gender roles. That's not what I mean. I mean gender. They wouldn't lean into their gender as much if things become very equitable. You'd think they'd be influenced by, oh, everybody's equal, so we all just wear plain blue shirts, like,
sure,
or just plain, we all wear pants. We all wear the exact same thing, and that's the opposite effect is taking place
of what's happening. Yeah.
That's an interesting thing too. Anyways. That this maybe is a conversation that would go too long for the podcast, I guess, at the moment, but I think it's worth thinking about. And I think the trans gender issue is a very, very hot topic, and it should at least be. It's very easy, and I see this as very common in the church, to just write off sin and say, it's sin. Like, don't do it. Like, that's just a bad idea. Don't do that. And it's like, well, you got to ask yourself for a question. Why? Why is that happening? What is going on right now?
Right.
Is it a response to something? What is actually happening in there? Because it's easy, but to just write people off and say, oh, that's just a wrong thing, and I don't believe in that. But then you don't create a bridge to understanding the person. You don't create a bridge to understanding exactly what's going on, which just isolates the church.
Right, you don't. And that particular issue is born around an obsession with the material. Right?
Which one?
Because
the trans issue?
Yeah.
The issue of a person wanting to transition?
Yes.
Well,
because your focus is that, regardless of what you feel or whatever, it's like, well, yeah, but the material doesn't reflect how I feel.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, but that's an obsession with the material. Like, in the same way, I don't think Christians should be obsessed with, or people in general, but Christians specifically shouldn't be obsessed with a number of different material things. But that is an obsession with the material and using the material to try and derive a sense of satisfaction and peace and calm and all those things. And I think the Bible calls us to not find our source of peace and comfort in material. That's hedonism. That is what that is. And I think the Bible is inherently anti-hedonistic. That's inverting. We've talked about the spiritual being on top, the material the bottom, the functional being sort of this place between the two, where the spiritual influences the material in the correct way.
I don't think it's a hedonistic. Well, in the most technical definition of hedonistic, you could say it's hedonistic, but I don't think in the common usage of hedonistic, it's not.
Maybe not.
I think
all hedonism is attempting to find spiritual peace through material means.
So yeah, that's why I said I think in the technical way it is.
Right.
I think the issue that you're having is someone is facing a particular torture, and they are. It's hard to not be incredibly sympathetic because they're trying to alleviate that. And honestly, that's an extreme measure to alleviate that. And so you have to be incredibly sympathetic to that. This person is trying the most extreme thing they can. And the part that I think is not, that should be talked about a lot, but really isn't, is there's not a whole lot of research, and I don't think anyone's even willing to do the research as to whether it works.
Oh yeah.
Does it alleviate the issue?
Right.
And there's some evidence that it doesn't tend to do that, which would be my suspicion. But if we're going to extremes with a lot of people in this case, and we have at this point in society, a massive public campaign of support, we have to there has to be even just people separate of the religious context saying,
and even if it alleviates it,
is
there is
this
the question for how long. Let me just point that out too.
Of course.
Yeah,
Well, the staying power is very, very significant.
Yeah.
Because there are certainly communities at this point that are being established of people saying, I'm 5-10 years down the road and I made a big mistake.
Right.
And that's really bad. That's really a tragedy that that's not being talked about. And truth be told, it's considered very, very it's cancelable to talk about that, to say, hey, why aren't people talking about this? Why aren't people thinking about this? But I guess, and then you come back to this and you see there's some sort of warning about it very early on.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, there is a warning about it, but yes, I what you are saying is not incorrect. There's a suffering associated with that, certainly. Like there absolutely is, and it's an attempt to alleviate a suffering, for sure.
All humans
for sure.
suffer.
Well, yes, yeah.
I mean, we all run into the own thing,
and that's where I say the hedonistic thing.
Correct, you're saying,
right?
And that's why
the drug
addict.
Technically, the drug addict is suffering. That's why they're doing the drugs. That's why they're an addict, because they're suffering, right? And so it's like, okay, we're all suffering. Where are you going for that alleviation? Right? Where are you going to find the peace in your suffering? And I think the answer is to look up to the spiritual, not down to the material,
That's why I'd say it's technically hedonistic. I don't want to associate the same amount. I don't want to associate it with someone who just gorges themselves on good tasting food and gets drunk all the time and has
pounds jelly beans or whatever,
and has
right?
sex all the time. It's a different type of thing.
Well, hold on. I actually think maybe it should be associated with those things. Maybe the problem there is that Christians don't have enough compassion towards those things too.
Yeah, I'll look at it.
Because you're saying you don't want to associate that with because people don't have compassion towards those things. And what I'm saying is maybe that's the problem. Maybe Christians need more compassion for the drug addict, for the person lost in promiscuity or whatever it is, right? Maybe we need to understand that they're acting out suffering instead of looking and saying, well, they're making a choice. And it's like, they're making a choice, right? But why? Why are they drawn to that choice? And you would say pleasure, and it's like, okay, but you are someone, if you're a Christian, who claims to know the joy and pleasure that comes from behaving rightly before God, and that doesn't compare, right? And yet these people are still making that choice to choose the thing that doesn't compare. Well, why? Right? You need to ask yourself that and have compassion towards that. So I guess the term hedonism, I get what you're saying, that it lumps it into it with those things, but I think the problem there is that actually reveals not a problem with the term, it reveals a problem with the Christian's attitude towards those things. Mm-hmm. It's one of we don't love the sinner, hate the sin often. Mm-hmm. It's not treated that way. It just isn't. There are plenty of places where it is. I'm not going to say that it's not, but too often it is treated in a way where you look at the being trapped in sin as being the fault of the sinner. And it is that, but it's not for no reason, right? As we'll see here, right? It is not for no reason that Eve takes the fruit or the woman takes the fruit. And it's not for no reason that the man also has the fruit, as we'll see coming up here. There's a reason they're doing that. And so we need to understand that the nature of sin is that there's some thing that precedes that, some disquiet, some words of the serpent, if you will, that predicate the sin. So all right, well, from that we might touch on this stuff again in some future episodes. So if by some miracle this has remained on YouTube, be sure to find the other episodes all on some alternative platform, because these subjects and this kind of discussion of them is not allowed regularly, let's say, in mainstream platforms anymore. So main takeaway though from this verse is that God and God alone, that's the key with the sleep thing, created a dual dynamic in humanity that allows humanity to be the help that it needs for itself to undertake the task of being the image of God and subduing the earth. And the purpose of all this, as always, is so that we might understand how to function properly within God's established order. So that's sort of broadly what I think we see here in this passage. All right. So with that, check us out on all the different platforms, like and subscribe and Rumble and whatever you do on your platform of choice. If we're not on a platform that you think we should be on, feel free to let us know. And shoot us an email, unschooledtheology@protonmail.com. And who knows, if this ends up in the right hands of the right people, this could be the hate mail episode. So we'll look forward to that. And we'll see you next time for the next verse, maybe two. We'll see. See ya.